Hello and welcome to this course with Groove 3. This series is all about how to create various different types of synthesizer patches using the new Meld synthesizer inside of Ableton Live 12. What I'll be doing in this course is showing you how to use the Meld synthesizer and how to create various different types of patches. We'll make bass patches, we'll make pads, leads, and effect sounds. Everything will be included in the course materials as well, so if you'd like to download the MIDI or the actual patch that we're creating in the video, you can do so on the Groove 3 website. So the first patch that I'll be showing you how to make is going to be this frequency modulated bass stab. It's going to sound something like this. So if you're curious about the MIDI, here is that simple note pattern that we're working with. Basically, it's all just functioning around E as the root, and then we're doing this semitone movement to add a little bit of tension. It's technically outside of the minor or major scale, but it gives us this interesting chromatic sound that's found commonly on a lot of house type records. So that's what we have going on with the MIDI. The thing to note here about this melody that makes it interesting is actually the movement and rhythm of these notes. So you can almost think of it more like a percussion element rather than being a very complex melody. But there's quite a bit of rhythm going on, which is what gives it its flavor. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy over the MIDI. So that way we have something to play. We'll go ahead and turn off the bass stab here, this instance of Meld. Then we can go ahead and get started with our new patch. So I'm going to go over here. We're going to go to Meld synthesizer. Go down to the Instruments tab here, and we're going to grab Meld. This synthesizer is a 2 oscillator synth. It also has 2 independent filters, and then some controls here for volume and tone shaping and pan and everything. It's also a pretty complex modulation matrix as well that we'll be using throughout this course. What's really fun about this synth though is there's actually a lot of customization that's built into it because of these oscillators. There's a lot of different styles of oscillator, even some really cool ways of locking the oscillator and some of the detuning and stuff to the key of your track, which we'll talk about in other videos. But there's some nice workflow optimizations that make creating more complex synth patches really simple. So for example, with this patch, we're going to be using the Simple FM, which is going to give us a much more simplified and streamlined version of a frequency modulation synthesizer, which is a type of synth that is really interesting sounding, but it's notoriously difficult to program because there's a lot of complex things you have to set up properly, especially once you start dealing with more complex operator setups. So this really simplifies everything out and makes it much simpler. So right now our default patch just sounds like this. Let me go ahead and turn on my MIDI here. So we get a simple sine wave. Then as we increase this amount, it's going to increase the amount of frequency modulation. We also have to adjust the ratio as well. Going to change the frequency modulation ratio. So you can see it's almost like an LFO being applied to the sound. The setting we want to use here is going to be 55.6. This is going to give us this really interesting overtone. And we want to use 57.9 over here on this amount. Now this ratio control is going to be very important to set to the exact value here. This is going to control that overtone that we have. So if this is set slightly out, we don't get quite the melodic sound we're going for. But if we have that set to 55.6, we get an overtone that has that kind of cool harshness, but it actually sounds resonant in a way that's sort of compatible with the notes we're playing. So make sure that you set this to the proper value. You kind of almost have to tune the ratio and amount together in order to get them to sound like a cohesive synthesizer patch that's nice and melodic. Okay, so then we can go ahead and move over to our filters. This is where we're going to get a lot of the movement for our sound. So we're basically going to be taking this filter and modulating it upwards to create kind of like a wobble. So basically going to be doing that automation, but with an envelope. So let's go ahead and turn that all the way down so that it is at 20. Let's give a little bit of resonance here. I'm going to do like 12.5 or so. That way we get a little bit more resonance in the movement. It's going to make that kind of have more of a whomping sound, which is quite nice. We're going to go ahead and link these as well. So I'm going to hit this button right here. So that way that envelope A is linked to envelope B. So if I make a change here, let's say we have the fade in. Now that fade in is copied over here. So it just keeps everything a little bit more streamlined, especially if you're going to have multiple oscillators together. Then you could have one envelope, just make one adjustment here and adjust it for both, which is quite nice. So for this one, we're going to be making a slight change to the amplifier envelope. And then mainly everything's going to come from the modulation envelope. So let's create just a little bit of attack here. And right now you can hear much because this is closed, but we'll be opening that here in a moment. I want like 3 milliseconds of attack, so that way there's no little click or anything happening at the start of our sound. And then let's go ahead and make this modulate our filter. So let's go ahead and go to the matrix. Let's go ahead and click on our filter. That'll go ahead and jump down to the section in our matrix where the filter frequency is. Alternatively, if you'd like a larger view of this whole modulation matrix section, you can hit this button. It's going to give you this very large, like full screen view, or we can close it out by hitting on this button here. Okay, so then let's go to our matrix again. We'll click over to matrix, click on that filter. We want to go to the modulation envelope, which is going to be right here, and crank that all the way up. So now this is being moved by the modulation envelope. So then we can go over to the envelopes tab. And right now it's going to sound like this. Kind of gives us chomping sound where it starts all the way up 100% and then closes out. But we want to go ahead and have that fade in. So I'm going to put this in. I'm going to go ahead and increase this. And now we're starting to get that kind of classic house stab bass. We'll do like 42.3. That'll give us just a little bit of attack. This is a parameter that you'll want to adjust depending on the speed of the song that you're playing. So in our case, this sounds nice, but you may want this to be slower or faster depending on the speed of the record that you're making. Now let's go ahead and make that decay just a little longer. We'll do 7.29, and then we're going to click on this icon right here to go ahead and tighten up that curve. So we'll go to that slope and make sure that's 100%. And then that's going to give us a much more snappy tone. So let me go ahead and turn off those drums so you can hear this by itself. And it's now starting to give us a much more interesting stab bass. So that's going to be all for that first frequency modulation oscillator. Let's go ahead and add in another one. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off by hitting on this icon right here. We'll click on B, go ahead and change that over to the simple frequency modulation. And then we can go ahead and increase the amount, which again, before you do the ratio is not really going to do anything. So let's go ahead and crank that ratio up. And I kind of want this one to be similar to the other one, but we're going to almost have like less frequency modulation. And it'll be layered in with that secondary wave, so we kind of have two different frequency modulation bits. And then this one's going to be set to 55.6. So listen how this sounds a little bit out of tune. If we type this in. So you got to play around with this until it matches the kind of overtone series. And we basically have these matched to one another. So they have the exact same frequency modulation ratio, but different amounts, giving us two different tones that are blended together. Let's go ahead and make that move just like the other one. So let's go ahead and put the filter all the way down on the state variable filter. Put that Q at 5.5, just so we have a little bit of kind of whomping sound from that resonance. And then let's go ahead and make sure that that is also applied to our envelope. So we'll go to the matrix, click on that, make sure the modulation envelope is over here, and then go ahead and crank that up. Now the other thing that I want to do as well is I want to add just a little bit of resonance. Then we'll blend in that first wave. Then we'll go ahead and make sure this is set to mono. And then I want to kind of detune these. Let's go ahead and set this to mono. And then we can go ahead and crank up the drive to 61. So that was a little bit more crunchy sounding. And let's also put the final volume here at like 3 decibels or so, just so it's a little bit louder, just so we have more gain coming out of our synth. Go ahead and turn that down a little bit. We are getting sort of an interesting sound here. We're actually technically creating like a phase cancellation on the low end. In the case of this, it actually sounds interesting. You could theoretically detune these off of one another a little bit to bring it back in some of that sub bass. Another way to adjust that, if you wanted to pull back on some of that phase cancellation, is go to the volume of this top one and go ahead and drop that down. So as you may have noticed, there's a little bit of loss in the low end information because these two waves are phase canceling one another. because they're at the same volume and they're playing the same note. And the phase of them is aligned, so it's creating this kind of weird sound where we actually are losing some sub bass. So one way you could fix this is to go over to that detune control and to go ahead and detune it. Or you could go over to the volume control in this top oscillator and then go ahead and adjust that and pull it back. And then that's going to give us more of that low end. There we go. That's going to bring back in that low end because now we don't have that phase cancellation. So then we want to go ahead and limit this up a little bit in case we have any peaks or anything coming out of that synthesizer patch. And then let's go ahead and add in some phasing. So I'm going to add in an effects device here because there's no internal effects on the synthesizer. We're going to add into chorus. Which is one of my favorite effects in Ableton. I use it all the time. So let's load in that chorus effect, and we'll use the ensemble to kind of help thicken it up just a little bit. Crank that amount all the way up. Make it a little slower. And by the way, in Ableton, you can actually use your arrow keys, the up and down, to adjust these values. So 0.36 is nice. And we'll pull back on that dry wet control, maybe like 20, just so we have like a touch of unison essentially. Kind of helps soften it up, makes it feel a little bit less digital. And then let's grab some compression from the glue compressor. And let's add just a touch of that. Let's go ahead and add just a little bit more attack, put that up to 3 milliseconds. We'll go ahead and put this to 1.2 on the release, keep it at 4, and then we just want like a touch of compression. Kind of looking for about 5 decibels of compression. Usually on the glue compressor, that sounds nice. A little bit of makeup gain. Maybe a little bit more. So that way it's a little bit snappier. See how it kind of pulls back on those mids? So it just helps pull everything together so it's a little bit snappier. And the last thing that we will do is add in a touch of reverb. This is going to be used for like a little bit of texture. This is something on these frequency modulated house basses that can sound super nice. So I'm going to crank that dry wet just so we can hear exactly what we're doing. So right now, definitely way too long. So let's drop that down to like 600 or so. So it's nice and short. We'll chop out those low frequencies and let those highs through. And let's crank the chorusing up. So there's a little bit more of like a weird pitch wobble. And then we just want a little bit of this. So it's adding like a weird texture behind it. And then let's also make sure there's a little bit of attack there, a little bit more release there, just so there's no pop. And then let's add just a touch of equalization. We'll use that just to add a little bit of highs here. So we'll add just a shelf here that is going to be 4 decibels or 4.3 decibels at 2.25. Just add a little bit of air in. And let's grab some of those mids, kind of those woofy low end frequencies there, about, let's see, that's a 124. And just pull back on those just slightly. Just kind of helps clear it up. Okay, so the final patch sounds like this. And with the drums, it sounds like this. Alright, so that's all for this simple frequency modulated bass stab. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.